Now, to start off our panel discussion, here's a question to start things out. Where'd it go here? Let me just switch to where I can see the questions a little bit better. I don't know who should take this first. So someone just like raise your hand and start speaking. How do we convey to the American public about the harmful economic consequences of not making proper geopolitical involvement in the Arctic a top priority? That's from Omer Khan of Brewer, Maine. How do we get this message across to the wider American public? Any thoughts? Now, President Grimson does this for a living, right? This is part of what your mandate is these days, is engaging not just the American public, but the world. But any way to jumpstart this further, do you think, Mr. President?
Well, I saw that David wanted to get into the discussion, but of course I can start, although it's perhaps not correct to say I do it for a living to influence the American public. But yeah, I've had a go of that over the years. And of course, it is an extraordinarily challenging task. But to some extent, as I mentioned yesterday, whatever you think about the Trump administration, by bringing the Arctic into their framework of global competition between China and the US in the 21st century, they perhaps gave us a political opening to talk about the Arctic to the American public, which we have not had before. My problem in talking about the Arctic to various American political leaders for more than 20 years is they tended to see it as a very remote subject, primarily a problem for Alaska. And this was illustrated by the fact that whereas the foreign minister of Russia turned up at every ministerial meeting of the Arctic Council, the American Secretary of State did not turn up until Hillary did so in Nuuk. And I hope she will excuse me from revealing to you that she then told me some years later that everybody in the State Department told her not to waste her time by going. So every official in the State Department was actually against her doing it, but it was her own political antenna that sort of decided that. So I think in the United States, this is a multi-layer problem. It's not just a problem for the ordinary Americans, although the weather patterns and the destructions of the cold winter in Texas and all the things give us an opening through the climate discussion. But it's also a problem with respect to the different ministries or departments in Washington. It's a problem with respect to many members of Congress, and it's also a problem with respect to the media. Apart from showing pictures of melting ice and polar bears and so on, the American media has not been particularly interested in the geopolitical transformation of the Arctic. So whatever you say about President Trump, his tweet about buying Greenland and Pompeo putting China squarely into the global competition that the US faces in the 21st century with respect to the Arctic, there is now a different playing field in the United States. How that playing field will be used will, of course, partly depend on where the Biden administration will stand on those issues. But quite frankly, if I may use the phrase, it's a hell of a task to try to influence the US public with respect to the Arctic.
We're good here in this order. David Bolton, did you have your hand up? Because I know Gail also did, but David first, then Gail.
So compared to the other 7 Arctic countries, the United States does have a challenge here. If you think of the other 7 Arctic countries, they have a great deal more affinity for the Arctic. They see themselves as northern countries. The Arctic has figured prominently in their histories and in their presence. In the United States, of course, we have more people living in tropical and subtropical areas by far. than people living north of the Arctic Circle. And so it is a challenge to get the average American to connect to the Arctic, but there are people, including people I see on the screen before me, who have spent a great deal of time and effort to try to do just that. And I do think that, at least incrementally, we have made some progress, that there is a greater awareness of the fact the United States is an Arctic nation, that things that happen in the Arctic affect people in Florida and Kansas and California and Texas. Some of it is related to climate, as President Grimson said. Some of it is related to other kinds of things too. But there's a whole lot more to do. The Camden Conference is part of a larger picture. You can probably throw a dart at any kind of calendar and come up with some Arctic-themed conference you'll find somewhere in the United States pretty much any given week. So we have, in fact, made some progress, but we still have a long way to go.
Let's go to Gail, and then after that, we'll switch to Sarah in Greenland. But Gail at Exeter.
Yeah, great. Thank you for those comments, and great to see you again, President Grimson. It's a long time since the World Economic Forum and when we met there in Davos. I think that extreme weather is the really easiest and most compelling way of engaging with the U.S. public. I think it's really clear the links between Arctic loss of summer sea ice and a lot of the extreme weather that the U.S. sees, whether that's in terms of floods, droughts, and storm surges is up the East Coast with the hurricane season. So, I think the idea that if you're in Sonoma Valley and you've been fighting the fires yet again and you're evacuated from your house out in California, you might not think that that's the Arctic, but it is. And I think that's one way that Arctic Base Camp, which is the not-for-profit that I also run, has been trying to engage with the U.S. public to try and say that climate change is real and Arctic is a key driver, and it is affecting the way the American public lives its life now and in the future. And we've enlisted the support of some really good communicators like the U.S. actor Rainn Wilson, of course, famously from The Office. Rainn's on our board, and we took him to Iceland and Greenland in 2019, straight out of the UN Climate Week, and he did a series of video shows on a dummy's guide to climate change, or an idiot's guide to climate change. And I think that kind of initiative is really helpful because it gets a message out by people that really know how to engage with not just those that are interested in climate change, but middle America. And getting that message out is the way to do it. And we've also engaged with, the youth industry, music industry. We had Billie Eilish work with us, Phineas, Ariel Winter from Modern Family, interviewing scientists on what does it mean and why is it important for normal people. And I think that's a really strong way of getting the message out and looking, certainly extreme weather, looking at how agriculture, food is grown in the US, water security, these kinds of things. So I think it's the really way of bringing it into why is it important for them.
In Greenland, Sarah Alsvig, I think you raised your hand.
Yes, thank you. I just wanted to echo what President Grimson said on the opening of giving space and giving a voice to us people who live in the Arctic, from the Trump tweets about and messages about the idea of buying Greenland. And I think it's going to be very, very important to maintain that opening, to make sure that the voices of indigenous peoples and self-governing nations of the Arctic is always part of the debate on the Arctic, also when it comes to geopolitics and security issues. I wanted also to highlight that the change of government in the US, of course, brings with it a new view on climate change, which I think is very, very important. And there is no doubt that climate change here in the Arctic is affecting the peoples who live here. In Greenland, it magnifies almost all of the challenges that we have. So the fisheries, housing, contaminants in our food, our infrastructure, with the melting of, for example, the permafrost changing infrastructure that was built decades ago. So this magnifying effect of climate change is something that is hitting us very, very tangibly. And that voice that is directly from the Arctic has to be very clear in the debate going onwards. And then another thing that the Trump situation or the idea of buying Greenland showed us the world is that the world has changed. I mean, last time the US purchased something from Denmark in 1917, the West Indies, that was before the UN, before the international law and human rights we know today. And that development where indigenous peoples have been some of the leading persons in developing a lot of aspects within, for example, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, having done all of that work now actually also positions indigenous peoples within international law in a different way than it was before. So it reminds us that that development is something that we have to really nourish and take good care of, that those rights are here to stay, and that the world has changed from back in 1917 when some islands could be bought in that way. So I think that it is that opening, although the ambiguous feelings towards a US president talking about buying Greenland, that opening is a positive thing that we all must remember to continue to use.
Professor Majewski, in Maine, you have worked in this field of trying to raise consciousness among Americans for a long time. I see you're ready to offer a comment anyway. I was curious, though, do you think what we've lived through with California fires, with Texas this week, is it moving the needle, or are views entrenched?
I do believe it's moving the needle, but I think we also have to understand that under the previous administration, even using the word climate, particularly in government and certainly for the public, people feared that. They were concerned that, in fact, they would be criticized, that they would be penalized, which is very unfortunate. In the process of the last few years in the past administration, the remarkable thing that's happened is there have been tons of grassroots organizations. I know in particular in the case of Maine, that have emerged as a consequence, but in some ways they've been underground for a long time. I think this is going to change dramatically under the new Biden administration. And I hope that the media begins to make a much stronger case about the relationship between these extreme events. Because when you come down to it, there are two things that I think most people care about, and that's their personal health and their wealth. And if you can actually convince them that this is in jeopardy, I think this Camden Conference and other ones like this are also very important because they point out the fact that clearly there are major issues going on not far away from us. And it's hard for many people to be sympathetic to this, unfortunately. But it is also a situation in which there are many lessons to be learned that have to do with inequity, linearity in the way the climate system works and the way there are political responses. And it's wonderful to see this conference bringing that out, and I hope the media understands that for the future.
Earl Watts, who's from the town just over the 2-cent bridge from where I grew up, he's from Winslow, Maine. He writes, given that both China and Russia have displayed a willingness to flout conventional norms regarding territorial expansion, you know, we're talking Crimea in one case, South China Sea in another, how does the world come together to address these issues when international norms are broken? We also coming off of a U.S. administration that liked to break long-standing norms about international behavior. Who'd like to start with that?
Well, maybe I can also start with that, because if you look at the Arctic, territorial claims with respect to Russia, for example, are more or less settled. The only territorial claims that still need to be resolved are between the United States and Canada and the Kingdom of Denmark. So I've often said that if the US and Canada and the Kingdom of Denmark could resolve their territorial disputes, the Arctic would be almost free of any territorial disputes, especially after Norway and Russia made an agreement, 7 or 8 years ago. So it is a misunderstanding that there is in some quarters that the Arctic is full of territorial disputes. That's not the case. And as David Bolton knows better than I, under his leadership and with the involvement of others, a few years ago, a remarkable treaty was agreed how to govern the Arctic Ocean once it's ice-free. It's one of the remarkable agreements, global agreements in recent years, where Russia, China, Korea, European Union, United States, and others came together and made a very enlightened agreement of how to govern the ice-free Arctic Ocean. So kind of paradoxically, one can throw the ball back at the US, Canada, and Denmark and say, if you guys can solve your problems, we could have a more or less dispute-free territory in the Arctic. But I also want to add to the previous discussion just one or two sentences, because these are two very different goals. One, to use the Arctic as a part of the climate change campaign, which can be done in multiple ways. And then the other goal is to let the political, military, business establishment in the US realize and understand the new geopolitical transformation that is taking place in the Arctic. And in order to gain success, one has to be very clear about that these are two very distinct goals.
So we're going to go like this. We're going to go Michael Bravo, then to Ulf Svedrup. So Michael, you're first, and then Ulf in Norway. You'll be not far behind.
Thanks. Yeah. Well, I'd like to build on two aspects of that, actually. First, in terms of flouting international norms and the need for a consensus, well, there is a need for building international consensus, and that's obviously particularly around the climate emergency. And as we were saying earlier, that involves bringing together major powers with really different ways of looking at the world. So 2 points that I take particularly from having listened to other speakers in this colloquium. One of the things I found most interesting over the last 2 days was to hear how history and historical understanding kept coming back in through many speakers, Sergei Medvedev, prominently through yours, Sarah, and Gun-Britt also. I mean, if you want to know what Indigenous people think, you are really talking to people with great historical awareness. So I think actually mutual understanding of others' histories is really key to achieving the kinds of consensus we might be hoping for. And then the second point would be that there's a lot to gain actually in the Arctic through cooperation. And one of them actually is the reputation, a reputation for good governance and for being a good citizen. The Arctic is a very good place to do that. In that sense, I think China actually has so much to gain from being a good citizen in the Arctic. And so, by the way, to the other Arctic nations and states and observers. So interesting, it will be interesting to see how reputations garnered and improved in the Arctic might be put to use in very different political arenas elsewhere.
Ulf Svedrup, get your hand up.
First, let me say thank you so much to the organizers for putting together this conference, because one of my takeaways from listening to this is that we need to think about the changing Arctic very much as kind of that is happening. It's happening rapidly, and it will have profound implications. Yet, it's not kind of a classic geopolitical competition that is coming out. So we need to think systematically about how to ensure cooperation and at the same time prepare for some kind of competition. So, and this brings me to the question about the territorial expansion. I don't see that as very likely. The Arctic is a very distant space, very far away from markets. It's dark, it's cold, it's a very harsh environment. So territorial expansion is not easy. It's really difficult. But what I think we should keep an eye on in terms of the geopolitical competition is the vulnerabilities of the societies, and in particular how vulnerable they are for hybrid warfare. hybrid actions. So digital communication is very vulnerable. Heating system, small infrastructure interventions could make life very difficult. So when we think about some of the main risks, I think, in Arctic communities, they relate to hybrid actions. So I would just want to mention that. Thank you.
I'm going to start. There's been a lot of interest in so much of what we've been talking about, but some of our participants would like us to drill down on something that came up yesterday. Gunn-Britt, I'm going to ask you to talk more about this. Here's how part of the question was phrased. You may not have to, the rest of us could address the specific question here, but this is one of the ways it's come up. Tom DeMarco asks us, isn't this whole conference about the tragedy of the commons? What hope can you offer us that mankind, humankind, will ever learn to grapple effectively with this essential human dilemma? I mean, Gunn-Britt, yesterday you made the point that when you're peddling green solutions, don't do it on the backs of your people. But are you left with a sense that there could be sustainable, proper solutions that don't exploit vulnerable populations?
Yes, thank you for that question. I've been engaged in Arctic cooperation for 20 years now, and I have been many times heard presentations about climate change and red reports and so on. And I keep thinking of what can we do? And what I tried to convey yesterday is one of my concerns that we often see when we try to address a serious question, the solutions are creating new ones. And the most vulnerable ones are with this kind of less heard ones are those carrying the burdens many times. So I have come with this rounds of thinking, I've come to that one solution is, not solution, the challenge is consumption patterns, even my own, of course. And that is the one thing that we, even though it's a small steps by doing something with your consumption, but I think the consumption is also about the individual and personal awareness of what can be done. I am a believer of a strong political leadership to make systematic changes, but I think we also have to do that with the personal consumption patterns that are driving the productions and all that. And that's why I also was calling for a circular economy thinking. Because I also believe that is, I grew up in the 70s, and that's not that long ago. And that's exactly what we were having in my childhood, that we didn't buy much stuff in the grocery store. We had the most things ourselves. So still the traditional livelihoods are, even though they are use technology as well, they're still the most, maybe the, most circular, if you can use that word. Yeah, but my concern to the previous question, if I may, very shortly, is that what I feel also is, yes, I'm happy to hear that there are few tensions on the international relationships and the claims to the Arctic and so on. But I also feel that there are disputes on land at the national levels, and what I was trying to also convey yesterday, and that is worth a concern too. And I often feel that indigenous peoples and maybe also other land users are never important enough to be really brought up to the front of the discussion, because we try to create these big discussions of what we hear now is not a deal at all of disputes in the Arctic.
Anyone else want to weigh in on this notion of framing this as a tragedy of the commons issue? I mean, first of all, there is some progressive thinking that the tragedy of the commons is a misunderstanding, and that it isn't a law of physics for instance. But many people here on the panel, I think, have spoken of even if you're dealing with self-interest, self-interest leads you to want to address a sustainable future for the Arctic, wouldn't you say?
Can I say something about the tragedy of comments? I think that, can you hear me, David? Yes. Just give you one example. Maybe 8-10 years ago, people were really concerned about the fish stock on wild cod, migrating cod, that's in the Barents Sea. Fishing was quite high, and people were concerned about the future of the fish stock. Today, the fish stock is record big, and it's managed in a very sustainable fashion. And it's managed well between Norway and Russia and other European countries as well. And so this tells us that science and good cooperation on scientific methods can establish the playing ground and the rules for extracting of resources and managing resources. And this could be done even in a situation where you have political conflict on many other topics, also in security issues. And what we have seen is that this management has actually increased the total stock of fish, so this benefited everyone, all parties. So I think that you're right in saying that the tragedy of the commons is realistic and a likely, or not, it's a possible outcome. But at the same time, it's possible to put up governance regimes to manage the situation. So my best advice to you, when you said also about the US bringing this to the top of the agenda, I don't think the Arctic deserves to be on the top of the agenda of US politics, because there are so many other things you should take care of. But green policy should be on the top of the agenda. The linkage between green policies and multilateral cooperation should be on the top of the agenda. And also a good science basis for governance of resources is actually very important. So that would be my recommendation.
Gail Weidman, you want to say something?
I did. Great. Thank you. I actually have a different perspective. Both, I think that the Arctic is the canary in the coal mine of climate change, and I think the new U.S. administration has made it clear that climate is at the top of the agenda. And what I would say to the President Biden is that the Arctic is one of the best examples of the urgency of that policy focus, and because of that, I think it is keen to say that actually this is a tragedy of the commons, and it's also a drama of the commons. The summer sea ice and the loss of the Greenland ice shield at the current speeds is clearly related to CO2 emissions around the world. And so it's looking perhaps at fish stocks of cod is one way to do it. But if you're taking an Earth system perspective from a scientific perspective, much bigger than that, you cannot walk away from saying that this is absolutely the tragedy and a drama of the commons. That doesn't mean that there's not hope. I said yesterday in my session, I have more hope today than I did 5 years ago, but it is definitely a time of urgency, and we're going to have to decide, are we going to continue to make it a tragedy, or are we going to turn it into something much more positive? And I think the U.S. has a key role to play in that.
Sarah,
could I jump in there?
Oh, wait.
Just
go ahead. Yeah.
Could I just jump in and say, yeah, I guess we both agree that it's not the CO2 emissions in the Arctic that's the problem. It's the global CO2 emissions, right? So in some sense, the Arctic is a casualty of those emissions, because I agree with you, the CO2 emission is a big, big challenge.
Sarah, I'm sorry, I interrupted. Thank you, Ulf.
Thank you. Yes, there's so many things to comment on, but this latest remarks, I also just wanted to highlight again what I also heard Gunn-Britt Rattler talk about yesterday, that no matter if it is the climate change that is the issue or the great power competition in the Arctic, the point is that both of those things can end up resulting in new forms of colonization. And that is what we have to avoid by having indigenous peoples and Arctic self-governing nations at the table all the time, because we have gone through too much colonization of Arctic peoples as well as other peoples in the world. And it would just be unacceptable to go through another kind of colonization in the years to come. So, and also the latest remarks here also shows the dilemma that self-governing nations can find themselves in. I can remind you that Greenland is not part of the Paris Agreement. Personally, I think that Greenland should have found a way to be part of the Paris Agreement, but the whole situation shows that the world has not been ready up until now. Will it be ready to actually make sure that peoples of the world, small peoples, people that are small in numbers, people that have self-government, actually have a seat and their voices are taken into consideration when you, for example, do an agreement on climate change? The issue was two things. The Greenland government was talking about indigenous peoples' rights not being visible enough in the agreement, but also that Greenland needed to continue to pursue development of, for example, large-scale industrial projects or mining. But back to the other point, no matter what happens, I think it's going to be very important in the years to come to remember that those decisions, for example, on mining, have to be taken by the people of the Arctic themselves.
So we've just hit the halfway point of this session, and we're going to switch the vibe just a touch. We're going to make, part of this is us, the panelists. We're going to try to make our answers shorter now, because I'm going to blast through a bunch of questions. The questions won't be knit together quite as flawlessly as I was trying before. We're just going to go through a bunch, but shorter answers from the panel so I can get a bunch of these questions in. Thomas, I'm going to start with you on this one. Thus far, China's interests and initiatives in the Arctic have been little discussed. Robert Sargent of Sargentville, Maine, it says here, unless that's a typo, wants to know what is up with China and the Arctic. I know you talked to the captain of a Chinese icebreaker, didn't you?
Yeah, I was in Shanghai at the Arctic Circle event about a half year ago. And then I was invited to come to the bridge on board the Xuelong, or the Snow Dragon, at that time the only icebreaker of China. I was actually surprised that climate change was so high up on the agenda in China. It was not too much focus on the natural resources and what we read in many North American and European newspapers. It was climate changes for very, very natural reasons. I mean, Shanghai, if you have a few inches of water more on the world oceans, the multi-million cities of Shanghai and the other nearby will have serious troubles. But this captain I talked to, he was not that much talking about the northern sea route as a new highway between Asia and Europe. He was more talking about the trans-Arctic route. And that is also the place where he had been sailing. He had been 3 times to nearly to the top of the world, nearly to 90 degrees. And we often think that China and Russia are allies in shipping in the Arctic. But I think that China want to avoid paying taxes on sailing Russia's northern sea route, and they are patient. They want to wait until the ice is so thin that they can actually sail straight across the North Pole and down to the markets in Europe. And as he said it, that is not going to happen this year, it's not going to happen next year, and it's not going to happen in his career as a captain on an icebreaker, because the ice conditions in the high Arctic oceans are just so unpredictable that for shipping companies, especially those sailing with containers that need a strict schedule, it's too unpredictable yet. It's coming, yes. But it's not tomorrow morning.
Yeah, it came up yesterday that China now has an Arctic policy, right? That was mentioned in the presentation. Fran, I'm going to give you this one. It's a general question from Christopher Weimer. We've touched on pieces of this, but I'd be interested to hear your take. Other questioners have asked about, since this is a global problem, since Antarctica presents a global issue, how come it's not the whole world that has a voice in dealing with this? But the question at hand is, how will diverse actors with an interest in the Arctic find a common approach on fossil fuel, climate change, self-governance for indigenous people, and so forth? What's your sense of the best way for there to be a common forum for moving the needle on this issue?
Well, as you know, we have a forum, the Arctic Council, which has been in existence for 25 years. And it is the place where the Arctic nations can not only talk to each other, listen to each other, find common ground together on things that are important, where there's both a self-benefit and a mutual benefit. So the agreements that have already come forward, search and rescue, oil spill response, international scientific cooperation, and most recently, the Central Arctic Ocean Fisheries Moratorium, illustrates the answer to your question. It is where there is both this self-interest and shared common interest that the countries come together. Now, beyond that, where there is individual national prerogatives, responsibilities, legal frameworks, and priorities, it's very difficult. And it really becomes probably more likely that there is more of the multilateral or bilateral agreements where in a region it is clearer what the mutual benefit and the self-benefit is in a way that's compatible. But I would say in general, back to the theme that you have heard both days, for many of us who have spent time in the Arctic and on Arctic issues, there is much more that we actually share than we disagree about. And I think continuing to provide not just the forum, the exchange of ideas, the exchange of scientists and students and policymakers, but also the rhetoric that leaders use, which is why I am very enthusiastic about the switch in the US to a rhetoric of cooperation and coming together on important issues, whether it's climate change or other things. So I'm hopeful.
There was a question. Oh, yeah, Professor Medvedev.
Yeah, so just a brief intervention here, and I know this may sound controversial and it will sound a bit heretic here, but at this point, once again, in 2021, I do not believe in multilateralism. We are actually driving towards a world of national egoism and the big crisis of international institutions. I think at some point, this phase in international relations will be overcome. But at this point, I really believe in unilateral action by significant players. I think that individual nations should take proactive initiatives, unilateral initiatives in limiting their environmental impacts and limiting their engagements. Like, for instance, I'm fascinated by the Norwegian initiative, to stop cutting down, forest so that, there is no use of the forest, there's no deforestation in any way in the world that contributes to the economy. So I think the initiatives of this kind should be really taking the front seat, because obviously the Arctic is not like the Antarctic. It's an area, let's face it, of course we have lots of common interest, right? But first of all, we have lots of national egoism and ambition and egos, and Arctic has been the site of international competition for decades. And it's not like the remote Antarctic. It was very easy to agree on the Antarctic in 1958, right? But on the Arctic, it's a totally different thing. So while, we can wait for decades, for key players to agree on some key issues, especially as China comes to the table. So, I think that it depends on national governance, on the United States, on Canada, on Russia, eventually, I think, when things change in Russia, not with the current government, on Denmark and other Arctic nations to take proactive approach, and then, others will follow. So there will eventually be a market for such initiatives, and, the reputation benefits, the sort of the immaterial benefits from this kind of policy will really play an important role.
Well, China, a huge emitter of climate gases, has also made enormous strides. But one of the somebody sent an insightful question, Sergey. What's Russia doing on climate change? How are they doing?
Well, that's a hard question. To begin with, once again, I think Russia is a thoroughly environmentally unfriendly nation. You see, environmental protection is not written down in our national code. We're not friendly to our own environment, right? The way we live, the way we litter, the way we use our resources. This country is premised on the idea of inexhaustible resources. And we're still living in this very early modern ideology, mythology that resources, we have the Siberia out there, we have the forest out there, and we can dump all things in the forest like many Russians do, right? Now the forest is just a big dumping site somewhere outside the fringes of the city. People will leave their litter on the side on the highway. Somebody will pick it up. So I would say that given this kind of a national mentality, we've been, and we have like central heating. In the middle of the winter, it could be -30, -40, but people have open windows because it's so hot inside in Russian homes that, we're opening windows to make, it a little bit more breathable inside. So we're basically heating the atmosphere in Russia, because the heating is so cheap in our country. So, from this point of view, I would say, Russia, of course, has been, taking a certain stance on the Paris Climate Agreement, but I think it has to do not really with a sincere environmental concern as with sort of geopolitical stakes. Okay, here's an important market in which we have to make a stake. We have to be a global player on as many fields as possible, and this is one other place where we can be a global player, and therefore environment sometimes, is entered into all sorts of Russian strategies. But, I have yet to see a significant national initiative or a significant breakthrough in Russia's environmental inputs. So far as the Arctic is concerned, I think the headlines are the environmental catastrophes which have taken place in 2020 with the oil spillages, with the spillage in Kamchatka, of which we cannot find the proper reasons, and so on. So eventually, I think Russia has to be very sensitive about this. And this was, the rationale behind my argument that Russia has to be in the front line of suggesting an environmental regime for the Arctic, because we're the most affected country in this, right? Russia is just sitting on the permafrost. So, global warming in this country, it not really says it forebodes, like open water, okay, we have navigation in the Northern Sea route. No, we have an environmental and infrastructural catastrophe in 70% of Russia's territory, which is built on permafrost. So if the permafrost starts to melt, the pipelines will crack, the cities will crack, and, roads, bridges, railroads, everything will just float there. There will be, Siberia will be the world capital for malaria. It will be just one big bog, one big marsh. Siberia will turn into the world's biggest fridge. The air conditioning, the world air conditioning works on, the Russian permafrost, because it's it's cooling the world air. So Russia should be really concerned. You know, once again, if there's the oil spillage, Russia is the country with the biggest shoreline in the Arctic seas, right? So if anyone is interested in the environmental regime for the Arctic, this should be Russia. But once again, this entails a very long-term strategic thinking. And this is really what my country is bad at, strategic thinking, long-term thinking. We in Russia really these days are thinking like 1 week ahead. It's very difficult to plan 1 month ahead in Russia these days. So, you know, many things have to change in order, you know, for my country to realize its national security needs are not, you know, NATO policies or whatever, you know, or Western involvement in Russian elections, but the national security interest is the environmental catastrophe in the Arctic. But it really takes a different policy making, a different kind of state governments, and basically good governance in Russia.
So to Cambridge, Michael Bravo.
Just a quick note to say, you know, I would dare not dispute what you've just said, Sergei. But I think, as you'd be the first to admit, Russia is also a very complex country. And I'm thinking of the work of people like Alana Wilson-Rowe, who've interviewed Russian scientists. So there is also a more varied story, even if it doesn't change the current outcomes. It does seem that there are many Russian scientists who are very serious about climate change, that Russia at the time of Kyoto came on board, perhaps before some other major countries represented here. And lastly, I think in this conference, though they're not present, it would be really good to acknowledge the presence of the indigenous people of Russia represented at the Arctic Council through RIPON. They're not necessarily the best place to vocalize their positions on climate change, but I think they do belong at the table.
Yes, I totally agree. I mean, the science-wise, you know, I have a talk show on future trends on several radio channels, and I invite permanently. We have really top-level world scientists on climate change and so on. What we're talking about is policy outputs, right? With respect to climate change. What we're talking about is like national awareness of these issues. There was a recent poll, and you know, climate change takes something like place between 40 and 50 in the list of national priorities, as you know, polled by several thousand Russians. So was like selection from various data. So this is my concern. And the scientists, of course, are there. There's a big Soviet school. There is a great, you know, climatologists and so on. There's make no doubt about it.
So isn't it true? I think one of the questioners reminds us from yesterday that the new chairmanship of the Arctic Circle is Russia?
Council.
Of the Arctic Council.
Of the Arctic Council, yes.
That's correct. Iceland will wrap up its chairmanship in May, and Russia will take over for the next 2 years.
So let's talk about that just a little bit more. What does that mean?
Well, perhaps I can say a word about that because I spent a lot of time with the Arctic Council. Russia has announced a kind of program of work for the Arctic Council during its leadership. It is heavy on economic development, not so heavy on environmental protection, though, as Sergei is saying, perhaps a more enlightened approach from Russia would be to realize that it does need help, including from the other Arctic countries, in cleaning up parts of Russia. In fact, the Arctic Council has quietly done a lot of that over the years, and perhaps the Russians will allow it to continue. I hope so. One of the things I'm hoping the Russians do in their leadership of the Arctic Council is to actually strengthen the Council itself. There are any number of limitations, shortcomings the Arctic Council has, some of which can be strengthened. And I think at the end of 2 years, when Russia wraps up its chairmanship, it will want to point to ways in which it left the Arctic Council better than it found it. We'll see if it really steps up to do just this.
Can I just enter this discussion? Because I think this directs us to the big elephant in the room, which we in Europe and in America have not really dared to discuss and relates to our own view. And that is the following question. Isn't it essential in order to have success in climate change and to have success in the future of the Arctic, to have a more positive and constructive approach towards Russia. If we continue the present tendency to always put Russia on the spot, blame Putin for all kinds of things, election interference, make Russia the kind of big enemy, impose more sanctions, one sanction after another, we are simply isolating the largest Arctic state. We need to say in the Western Arctic discussion, Russia is the most important Arctic state. It's not the United States. It's not Canada. And it's definitely not Iceland or even the Kingdom of Denmark. Russia is the crucial Arctic state, where the Arctic part of Russia covers, as I said yesterday, 7 time zones. And now we have seen the investment in gas drilling, in oil, in minerals, and so on. So all these Arctic policies we have been discussing today will never succeed unless we engage Russia in a very constructive and positive way. Similarly, as has just been illustrated, it is very doubtful whether the Biden administration or the rest of us will be able to achieve our climate goals without constructive engagement with Russia. So the political establishment in the new Biden administration, as well as all of us, face this crucial question. Is it more important to carry on following what happened in Ukraine about 10 years ago, or in other areas of the world? Is that more important than trying to engage the largest Arctic state and a crucial climate player like Russia in our constructive policies towards the Arctic and the climate? And we avoid this question. It's hardly ever discussed in any Arctic meetings. And I am to blame for that as anybody else. But as the Biden administration, and we have all been very positive about the Biden administration, but unless it changes the approach towards Russia from what is now the established view in both the Republicans and the Democratic parties in the United States with respect to Russia, they will neither succeed in the Arctic policies or in the climate policies. And as the previous discussion indicated, we have always a tendency to try to put Russia on the spot, to find a weak spot where we can pressure Russia and say, you're not doing this right, whether it's indigenous or even climate policies. But we never, ever answer the question. Is it a higher priority in the relation towards the future of the Arctic and our climate to have a constructive relationship with Russia, despite all the difficulties in Ukraine and elsewhere? We simply have to make an evaluation in terms of real politics. We cannot avoid it if we want to be realistic about this whole discussion. Of course, we can continue, as we have done in the Arctic Circle assemblies and all these other meetings, talking about all the other issues and so on. But this is really the core issue. And during the Russian chairmanship is an ideal time for us to face squarely the question which is directed at us. Are we willing to change our policy towards Russia for the benefit of the future of the Arctic and for the benefit of the future of the climate?
Well, and David Bolton mentioned this morning that, for instance, some of the stuff can be segregated, that there's a good relationship with Russia on issues like search and rescue. But what do other people think about this idea of, to really get at the issues we've been talking about, it may suggest more engagement with Russia?
I think President Grimson's right in the sense that we do need more engagement and a different tone. But it is a matter of compartmentalization. It's not so easy to sweep aside Russian election interference, Russian invasion of Crimea, more recently Russian hacking of US computer systems at high levels, But still, we have common interests we need to be able to pursue if we're going, as he's right, to say that if we're going to succeed, we need their Russian cooperation, much as we need Chinese cooperation on a number of things, including, say, dealing with North Korea. We need, and this is what diplomats have to do. We need to be able to compartmentalize.
Michael Bravo.
Well, I agree with David. I mean, I think that's right. And it's been said already that really to understand Russia, it's easy to misunderstand Russia. So easy. And I think one doesn't understand Russia in the Arctic without understanding Russian history, for a start. Only then do you begin to understand that Russians really feel that they have a legitimate interest, that this is really at the heart of their country. This is part of Russia. I'm not saying that excuses or exonerates a whole bunch of other things, but it's certainly relevant. The other thing, I think if you want to look at major bilateral tension and border tensions, you're probably not really looking at Russia and the USA, or even Russia and say Norway or Finland. You're looking at India and China, or Kashmir. So to put it in perspective, yeah, there are tensions, but we see with the Arctic Council, we see with diplomats like yourself, David, that there are real opportunities to engage here. And as President Grimson says, why not engage with Russia? Surely they're the largest country in the Arctic, and that's indisputable.
May I?
Please.
Yes. I think, first of all, we are talking about Arctic Council, and I think we do engage with Russia. But when I stepped into the Arctic Council room 20 years ago, my sense is that it was more, the Russian language was more in use back in those days than it is today. So I think all the Arctic discussions have turned into very English language dominated discussions. And I think we have to also remember that the Arctic Council is not just politics, it's a three-party kind of partnership between science, Arctic states, including as well as observers, and the 6 indigenous peoples organizations as permanent participants. 4 of these 6 indigenous peoples organizations have people living in Russia, Inuit and Aleut on that far end, Sami at this end, and Raipon representing those in the middle, if I can put it that way. But I think we have to be better at in translating reports into Russian language to ensure that at least there's a better opportunity or better access for the Russian public to get the knowledge that the Arctic Council produces, or get access to the reports and knowledge that this produces. We will definitely use that for our membership on the Russian side. I'm pretty sure the Inuit Circumpolar Council will do that on as well, and Raipon. And then we have reached quite a lot of the Arctic inhabitants, but also better opportunity to reach out with the findings and summaries at least, and actually the work that is produced through Arctic Council. And Arctic Council is so much more than only the geopolitics. It's also the knowledge, not production as such, but knowledge assembling or collection and making it Arctic relevant. And I think that is the beauty of the Arctic Council, and we should continue that and also ensure stronger Russian language component.
Could I jump in here?
To that?
So who we got? We have Sarah, and who else? I'm sorry, I couldn't see.
So it was Ulf.
Ulf.
Yeah.
And
if
then
you want
Sarah. Okay, fine.
So should I say something first?
Yeah.
Okay. I agree with our Icelandic friend that you cannot ignore Russia. You cannot bypass Russia for establishing some kind of Arctic governance. So Russia is a really important country in the Arctic. But at the same time, I think that we have to be a bit cautious. We have to balance a dialogue and exchange with Russia, but at the same time also have some clear red lines and a policy of deterrence on something, because we cannot basically assume that we in the West should just accept anything coming out of Russia. So we have to balance between deterrence, have some firm red lines, but at the same time open up for a constructive dialogue with Russia.
Well, I apologize for interrupting, but what you have just described is the official Western view. But while we maintain this view, Russia, China, Japan, Korea in the last 5-10 years have escalated their cooperation and dialogue about the Russian part of the Arctic, which is the biggest part of the Arctic. So this view of setting all kinds of conditions before dialogue with Russia simply has opened up the scenario that, in my book, the most active players now in the Arctic are based on this new axis between Asia and Russia in the Arctic. And that is a reality that the United States, Canada, and the European part of the Arctic has to face. And if we continue these conditions for engagement and so on and so forth, this evolution of the Asian-Russian role in the Arctic will simply go stronger and stronger. And that role is primarily directed to oil and gas, mining, shipping, not climate, not indigenous rights, and the other issues that we are talking about. I know this is not easy, but we have to realize that while we keep on telling these things to each other, the world moves on. And that is why Putin changed the Russian government a few years ago, moving into single ministry, the Far East and the Arctic. And that should be a wake-up call for the rest of us, in addition to the new Russian Arctic policy, that while we are talking about these issues we have been talking about, the eastern part of the Arctic as it relates to Asia is being transformed on a bigger scale than we have ever seen in the Arctic before.
President Grimson, thank you. I'm going to go to Sarah Alsvik, and then we'll go to Professor Medvedev. Sarah?
I think that President Grimson has a very important point. And I think that the question is, have we left Arctic exceptionalism? If we look at the Arctic Council always working on the basis of consensus, when did that change? When did the Arctic Council for the first time not have a declaration? That was in 2019, when Secretary Pompeo from the US did the famous speech, which got a lot of attention, but more importantly and more worryingly, there was no declaration from that Arctic Council ministerial meeting. So I think that the current Arctic Council chairmanship, Iceland has a very big burden on the shoulders and a big task in making sure that the next Arctic Council ministerial meeting would actually end up and result in a common declaration. And then, of course, we'll see what happens in the next step with Russia as the chair. But my personal experience from working, for example, in the Arctic, the Standing Committee of Arctic Parliamentarians, when I was a parliamentarian, there is a sort of a wish from all sides to actually collaborate. And I think that we have a very, very serious situation in front of us in regards to sort of finding the balance in maintaining an Arctic exceptionalism and making sure that we can collaborate, although there is big challenges around in the world.
Professor Medvedev in Moscow?
Yes. Well, I would beg to differ with President Grimson, and actually not in the sense that I would suggest isolating Russia or imposing sanctions on Russia on the part of the Arctic Council. Especially since, this is now criminally punishable in Russia. If I suggest some kind of sanctions against Russia, I will go to prison in the next couple of months. But there's an important thing which he mentioned, and he said that we should be driven by the principles of realpolitik. And this has really surprised me, because I think that since 1945, the world has been driving towards more international liberalism and institutionalism rather than principles of realpolitik. And I really do believe that morality and ethical values do have a role to play, also in such areas as Arctic governance. I understand all difference between European Council, like Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, and the Arctic Council. You know, they are, of course, can impose sanctions. They can post a moral agenda, a moral view on the fact that, you know, Putin tried to change his main challenger, the main opposition leader, and now put him to prison. But, you know, Europe has learned these lessons. We have played utilitarian values versus deontological values, right? The logic of utilitarianism versus the deontology, the versus, you know, the Kantian idealism versus the moral values. I did so in the 1930s in the policy of appeasement of Germany. And I think that much of the Putin-Versteher discourse, the Putin understanders discourse, the Russia understanders discourse, goes along the same lines these days. Because it is all too comfortable and actually is placed precisely in the expectation of the Russian government. That despite everything that's happening in the country, we are a recognized international player in various international fora because we're so big, because we're so important, because there's a whole big legacy of Russian engagement in the area. So of course, for practical reasons, Russia has to be accepted and has to be given a voice. So I'm not, once again, I'm not calling for anything, but I think we have really to weight the practicality of certain policies versus the morality of certain policies. And for me, being inside Moscow, it's very hard to imagine that there's one story going on here with thousands of people, tens of thousands, being imprisoned. Or let's say, no, let's talk about Russia, let's talk about China. Can the Arctic nations deal with China as if nothing is happening, forgetting the concentration camp for the Uyghurs? Because Uyghur issue is just one thing, and we're playing on a different sheet of music, right? We're playing the Arctic music. So let's forget the Uyghurs. Let's forget the Chinese human rights policy. So should we forget the Russian human rights policy? Russia, I think, will soon go out of the Council of Europe, and next step, I think, within the next year, criminal death penalty will be introduced in Russia. So, of course, you can say that no death penalty in Russia is no concern for the Arctic governance, right? But even on a small issue, for instance, if we are engaging Russia, if you're translating things into Russian for better understanding, for instance, if you want to give a grant for the indigenous people in Russia, they may go to, they will be pronounced foreign agents for accepting money in any international money. So, you know, even in this small, innocuous, you know, small business, this big and nasty state will come into play, at least on the ground level. But on the top level, of course, you can say to your constituencies that, yes, we have to be engaging Russia. This is a big nation. We have to be talking multilateral and so on. So once again, I think really it's about weighting the utilitarian versus the idealist. I'm really sound a bit funny defending Kantian idealism in 2021, but I think it has a place in politics.
Okay, so we've, I don't want to end on that issue. Just a couple minutes left of this. Another positive tension in all our discussions, I think, another thread, has been this idea of an impulse to make other people solve the problem and not shoulder the burden on ourselves, however we want to define this. It came up yesterday when someone asked him, what about natural gas extraction in the Arctic? And part of the answer was there are messier fossil fuel production places elsewhere in the world that probably should be addressed before we stop that. Others said everything, you know, all this has to be addressed. What are your thoughts? Some of the questioners are interested in this, about making sure that we address the tendency to fix the problem by asking someone else to make a compromise, a sacrifice, or a concession. Final thoughts on that, and then we can go.
So David, this is another way of framing the tragedy of the commons problem, really?
Yeah, it is, isn't it?
It's
yeah.
How much tension is there between self-interest and common good, right? And we see this play out in so many different ways. And I would say in the space of whether it's the Arctic or any other geography, you have to understand something before you can care about it. And until you care about it, you're not willing to do something about it. So the question is, how do you get people to realize that they only if they really care about something and can do something about it, will they go beyond their self-interest? And I would say in the Arctic space, that's exactly what President Obama was trying to do when he held the huge glacier conference in Anchorage, and then went above the Arctic Circle, the very first US president to ever do that over 6 years ago. He wanted to demonstrate that at the highest level, he cared about the Arctic. He cared about the indigenous people of the Arctic, and he cared about the way in which Arctic change was actually impacting all of the United Not to mention the entire world. So I think all of us can play a role in not only doing what we first started talking about, which is explaining why the Arctic matters, why Arctic change, its dramatic pace really impacts people regardless of where they live. It is through that understanding that people can care, and after caring, they can act. They also need to see how they individually can act, not just through policy pronouncements. So I think the kind of thing that Camden is doing is fabulous. And I want to congratulate the people who have participated, help many people understand this region so that they can care about it and want to take action.
Any other final thoughts? Well, the producers of this have asked if anyone who has the impulse to do this, you're very welcome now in turn. If anyone wants to say goodbye in either their indigenous language or a language that's important to them, now's the time. So, I mean, Michael Bravo's going, what am I going to do? I mean, I believe like cheerio or something is appropriate, but you maybe think of one. From Maine, what do we say? See you later. Or on my father's side of the family, arrivederci, I will say. Anybody else got any?
Well, I think that it's a good thing that you brought up language. Gunther was talking about right before this that it was important to start to having the Arctic Council documents also in Russian. Today is actually Mother Tongue Language Day internationally. And from next year, it's International Decade on Indigenous Peoples' Languages. And some people say that knowledge is power. And I just wanted to, in that sense, also remind how important it is that we are able to speak about these issues in indigenous languages and in the languages that people of the Arctic speak. In Greenland, we have a challenge in regards to, for example, security and defense issues, because most policy papers are in Danish. A lot of information is in English. And it is a big task for us to start producing knowledge papers and articles in Greenlandic. So with that, and welcome in Greenland sometime.
How might the Sami people say goodbye?
Batsatjärvan.
Batsatjärvan. And what do we do in Russia? Like до свидания? I don't know.
До свидания. Всего доброго.
All right. Thank you very much, everybody.